My name is Dick Campbell, and for many years I have been a student of history. With this interest, I have created a variety of 5 history talks, which I've presented for the past 12 years to many local groups and other organizations throughout Wisconsin and even up in Fairbanks, Alaska. I call these talks Great Moments in History. And now I would like to share one of these moments with you entitled Shackleton's Incredible Voyage to the Antarctic. This is a story about one of my heroes of history, Ernest Shackleton. The story of Shackleton's incredible voyage to the Antarctic is an outstanding example of leadership in time of crisis and survival. Throughout this journey, Shackleton's leadership constantly installed the traits of hope, optimism, perseverance, and determination in his men. This is their story. In early 1914, an ad supposedly appeared in a London newspaper. Men wanted for a hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. This ad, placed by Sir Ernest Shackleton, signaled the beginning of one of the greatest of Antarctic adventures. The goal of this expedition was to cross the Antarctic continent overland from the Weddell Sea via the South Pole to the Ross Sea, a distance of over 1,700 miles, shown in green line on this map. When Shackleton began his Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, as it was called, he was already a national hero, with 2 polar expeditions behind him. His first attempt to reach the South Pole with 2 other men, Robert Scott and Dr. Edward Wilson, was in 1902. They traveled to about 450 miles of the South Pole before declining food supplies and Shackleton's illness forced them to turn back. His second attempt, that he led with 3 companions, was in 1908-09, the yellow line on the map. They came within 97 miles of the South Pole, but they had to turn back again due to declining provisions and failing strength. Then, as some of you may know, the race for the South Pole was undertaken by Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, the blue line, and British explorer Robert Scott, the red line on the map. Amundsen reached the pole on December 14, 1911, followed by 5 weeks later by a very discouraged Scott on January 18, 1912. All of Scott's 5-man company died on their return, trapped in a raging blizzard, a mere 11 miles from a vital supply depot. After Scott, no one set foot on the South Pole until October 31, 1956. Both poles had been reached, the North Pole in 1909 by Robert Peary, and the South Pole in 1911 by Amundsen, and Shackleton viewed the crossing of the Antarctic continent as the largest and most striking journey and the last remaining chance of fulfilling himself. After Shackleton announced his plans, he was overwhelmed by more than 5,000 applications from people who wanted to go along. Almost without exception, these volunteers were motivated solely by the spirit of adventure, for the salaries offered were little more than token payments for the services expected. They ranged from about $240 a year for an able seaman to $750 a year for the most experienced scientists. A total of 27 men were selected to make the trip. Early in his career, Shackleton became known as a leader who put his men first. This inspired unshakable confidence in his decisions, as well as tenacious loyalty. Two wonderful quotes about him revealed his leadership attributes. He was, as one of his men put it, the greatest leader that ever came on God's earth, bar none. Another said, "For scientific leadership, give me Scott. For swift and efficient travel, Amundsen. But when you are in a hopeless situation, when there seems no way out, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton." This then was the man who developed the idea of crossing Antarctica on foot. Born in Ireland, Shackleton was 40 years old when he summoned all his experience as explorer and organizer to bear on this ambitious undertaking. Shackleton could not yet know it, but the Trans-Antarctic expedition would amount to another failed expedition that he would be most remembered. The sailing ship for this expedition was a newly built 300-ton wooden three-masted ship named Polaris. It was powered by a coal-fired 350-horsepower steam engine capable of about 10 knots. It was 144 feet long with a 25-foot beam and built of planks of oak and fir up to 2.5 feet thick. Shackleton renamed the ship Endurance after his family motto, quote, "By endurance we conquer," unquote. On August 1914, the Endurance departed London, England, just as World War I was beginning in Europe. It headed south by way of Buenos Aires, where it spent 2 weeks loading supplies and equipment, while several adjustments were made to the crew. One addition to the crew was an 18-year-old stowaway named Percy Blackborough. The day after the ship left Buenos Aires, Blackborough was discovered and brought before Shackleton. He was subjected to an eloquent tirade from the boss that impressed all the other seamen. And in the end, Shackleton leaned close to Blackborough and said, quote, "Do you know that on these expeditions we often get very hungry? And if there is a stowaway available, he is the first to be eaten," unquote. Well, Blackborough boldly pointed out to Shackleton that he was bigger and would make a better meal. And Shackleton tried to hide a smile and told Blackborough to make himself useful, which he did as the ship's steward. On October 26, 1914, the Endurance, loaded with fresh supplies, 28 men, as well as 69 sled dogs and 1 cat, set out from Buenos Aires for the South Atlantic. The ship carried a wireless receiver, but could not afford to purchase a transmitting unit. It arrived at South Georgia Island off the southern tip of South America on November 5, 1914, and anchored at a whaling station. South Georgia Island was 100 miles from end to end and about 20 miles wide. Only the coastline was charted. The interior was mostly unknown. The whalers there provided the expedition with coal and clothing, as well as valuable information. Ice conditions were unusually severe that year, and Shackleton was advised to wait. So the brief time he had planned to spend on South Georgia turned into a full month. During this time, Frank Hurley, an Australian, the official photographer for the expedition, lugged his 40 pounds of camera equipment to the heights overlooking the harbor. and preserve the image of the Endurance riding at anchor below. Most of these pictures you will be viewing are from Hurley's glass plate shots, some of which were taken high above in the rigging of the ship. The Endurance steamed out of South Georgia on December 5, 1914, heading for the Weddell Sea and a hoped-for landing at Vassal Bay, from where a 6-man expedition team would begin their trek to the South Pole and then to the Ross Sea, to be picked up by another ship named the Aurora. As land receded behind them, they lost all contact with the outside world. By December 7, the ship encountered the outskirts of pack ice and was passing numerous icebergs. The ship presented an appalling sight. 69 Huskies were tied forward in dog houses. Several tons of coal were heaped on the deck amidships, and on top of the rigging hung a ton of whale meat for use as dog food. The Endurance twisted and squirmed her way through the pack ice for nearly 2 weeks, but it was a slow progress. Frequently, it was barely able to push its way through and had to heave to until the ice loosened. Whenever possible, the dogs were exercised on the ice floe. By January 20, 1915, the Endurance was permanently beset in the pack ice, only 85 miles from its landing destination. Held fast in the ice, the Endurance was now being carried with the rest of the pack ice by the Weddell Sea's current, and soon to be moving away from land. As one seaman's log recorded, quote, "The Endurance was beset, frozen like an almond in the middle of a chocolate bar," unquote. The crew, more than once, made efforts to free the ship from the ice floes, to no avail. At last, on February 24, 1915, Shackleton admitted that the possibility of getting free could no longer be seriously considered. They would have to winter on the ship, with whatever that might bring. One of the crew wrote in his log, quote, "Shackleton at this time showed one of his sparks of real greatness. He did not rage at all or show signs of disappointment. He told us simply and calmly that we must winter in the pack ice, explained its dangers and possibilities, never lost his optimism, and prepare for winter," unquote. During this time, sled dogs Sally and Samson produced 4 pups, here being held by Tom Crean, who was one of Shackleton's top crewmen. Boredom inevitably set in. Games of soccer on the ice and attention to the dogs provided some diversion. In the wardroom, the scientists amused one another by reading aloud in the evenings, and Sunday song fests were a regular event. Other diversions included games of chess and card games, and books were read and analyzed, along with lantern chats by photographer Hurley. The dogs were removed to the ice floes, and individual dog glues were built for them with blocks of ice and snow. Seals and penguins were harvested for food. The meat needed to feed both men and dogs over the winter. At below zero temperatures, they had no worries about food spoilage, as the fresh meat was automatically frozen. On May 2, 1915, their position showed a total northwest drift since the end of February of 130 miles. The Endurance was one microcosmic speck, 144 feet long, 25 feet wide, embedded in nearly 1 million square miles of ice that was slowly being rotated by the irresistible sweep of the winds and currents of the Weddell Sea. The sun disappeared entirely in May, not to be seen for the next 4 months. The strange mingling of faint daylight and a radiant moon on the frozen sea rendered the landscape mystically luminous. In all the world, there is no desolation more complete than the polar winter night. No warmth, no life, no movement. Only those who have experienced it can fully appreciate what it means to be without the sun, day after day, week after week, month after month. Few men unaccustomed to it can fight off its effects altogether, and it has driven some men out of their minds. Ice pressures around the ship began on July 21, with slabs of ice piled one on top of another. A few days later, there was a tremble followed by a scraping, grinding sound, and the Endurance rose suddenly upward, then heeled to port and dropped back in the water again. But it still couldn't move. The rest of August passed without incident, as the ship continued to be trapped in the ice. On the night of August 27, 1915, with the temperature at minus 24 degrees, Frank Hurley set up 20 light flashes behind hummocks of ice around the Endurance. The image he secured was haunting. The rime-crested Endurance breasting the ice, both gallant and vulnerable. Pressure ridges continued off and on until October 19, when a huge pressure ridge shook the ship. It took a list of 30 degrees in 5 seconds. The ship's beams cracked and exploded like pistol shots overhead. The Endurance was now being shaken and beaten constantly. Pumps could not keep the water out. After 8 days of this, it was time to abandon ship and take to the ice floes. The ship was being crushed. The pressure eased but returned to squeeze and splinter the ship until the ice alone held her afloat. The date was October 27, 1915. The temperature had fallen to minus 15 degrees. With the ship all but demolished, the crew set up camp on the ice floe near the Endurance after removing as many supplies and provisions they could. The 3 lifeboats were removed to the ice floe also, along with the dogs, and they called this site Dump Camp. They were over 300 miles from the nearest land. As always, with Shackleton, what had happened had happened. It was in the past, and he looked to the future. Without emotion, melodrama, or excitement, he said, quote, "Ships and stores have gone, so now we'll go home," unquote. Shackleton then proceeded to instill in his men the desire to survive. Since being beset in the ice 10 months before, the Endurance had drifted over 1,300 miles. Their position was about as bad as it could be. But Shackleton persuaded his men that they would get through. He simply willed them to believe that they would survive. He then explained how he would get them home. They would march over the pack ice to land. They would head northwest across the frozen sea to Paulet Island, over 350 miles away, shown here marked in red. This would require the men to drag with them their basic supplies as well as the lifeboats. Each man was limited to 2 pounds of personal possessions. And by way of example, before the assembled men, Shackleton took his gold cigarette case and a handful of gold coins from his pocket, and he dropped them on the snow. He then opened his Bible, inscribed to him by Queen Alexandra when they left London, and he ripped out the flyleaf, a page with the 23rd Psalm, and a page from Job, then laid the Bible on the ice and walked away. You might be interested in knowing that the words written on the flyleaf by Queen Alexandra were, quote, "May the Lord help you do your duty and guide you through all the dangers by land and sea. May you see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep," unquote. The page from the book of Job, chapter 38, verses 29 to 30 read, quote, "Out of whose womb came the ice, and the hoary frost of heaven, who hath gendered it? The waters are hid with a stone, and the face of the deep is frozen," unquote. The journey began on October 30 with an advance party led by Shackleton paving the way. Behind them came the other dog teams, pulling sleds that were loaded with 900 pounds of stores and gear. Bringing up the rear was the remainder of the crew, pulling the boats on sledge runners. It was a killing toil. After moving only a few miles in 3 days, Shackleton came to a decision that they would go no further, but stay where they were until the drift of the ice floe should carry them closer to land. The new camp, established on a sturdy ice floe some 4 to 6 feet thick and only a mile and a half from the wreck of the Endurance, was christened Ocean Camp. They salvaged whatever else they could from the ship. Hurley rescued his glass photographic plates, and Shackleton relented on his weight restrictions, and he allowed Hurley to save about 120 of his best plates. Hurley smashed the remainder, about 400, on the ice to remove all chance of second thought. Hurley also kept a Kodak pocket camera and 3 rolls of film, with which he documented the remainder of the crew's odyssey. Life at Ocean Camp settled into a routine. Wake up, wash your face with snow, eat breakfast, do chores, chop ice for water, shovel snow over the latrines, skin some penguins, cut blubber for the stove, feed the dogs, check the tent stakes. Afternoons, read, play cards, walk around the ice floe, play with the dogs, eat dinner, read some more, and sleep. They continued to drift northwest at the rate of a little more than 2 miles a day. They were castaways in one of the most savage regions of the world, drifting they knew not where, without hope of rescue, subsisting only so long as Providence sent them food to eat. On November 14, 1915, this was all that was left of the wreck of the Endurance. 7 days later, it went under. They watched in silence. The stern of the Endurance rose 20 feet in the air and hung there for a moment with its motionless propeller and its smashed rudder aloft. Then slowly, silently, it disappeared beneath the ice, leaving only a small gap of open water to mark where it had been. Within 60 seconds, even that was gone, as the ice closed up again. It had all happened in 10 minutes. Shackleton noted simply in his diary that the Endurance was gone, and he added, quote, "I cannot write about it," unquote. And so they were alone. Now in every direction there was nothing to be seen but the endless ice. Their position was 68 degrees 38 minutes south, 52 degrees 28 minutes west, a place where no person had ever been before, nor could they conceive that anyone would ever want to be there again. It was a finality. The ship had been a symbol, a tangible, physical symbol that linked them to the outside world. Now it was gone. Another attempt at walking to land was made on December 23. After a week of back-breaking labor, they had gained up only 8 miles, and the walk was abandoned again. A new site on the ice was set up and christened Patience Camp. It was now January 16, 1916, and still the ice pack showed no sign of breaking up. They continued to float northwest, waiting for the breakup, so they could take to the 3 lifeboats and row to land. For the next 3 months, the men survived as best they could on the ice floe and waited for an opening. March was bleak. The last of the 69 dogs were shot for food. The men lay in their tents, huddled in their sleeping bags that had frozen stiff. In April, the ice cracked through their camp, and Shackleton knew that the long-awaited breakup was at hand. On April 9, he gave the order to launch the 3 lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, all named after financial sponsors of the expedition back in England. 28 men crammed aboard them, 11 in the Caird, 9 in the Docker, and 8 in the Wills, with their basic camping gear and rations. The temperature dropped to minus 10 degrees, and the high seas poured over the open boats and men who had no waterproof clothing. The men had been trapped in the ice for 15 months, but their real ordeal had just begun. Day and night, through the minefield of grinding ice, then through crashing waves of the open sea, the helmsman of each lifeboat tried to hold his course, while his shipmates bailed constantly. Shackleton gave the order to run due north with the wind behind them for a splinter of land 60 miles away called Elephant Island. For 7 sleepless and terrifying days and nights, the men endured cold that froze their clothing. Killer whales rose beside the boats, taking the measure of the helpless men. Shackleton stood erect and day and night on the stern of the Caird, as he knew it was important to his men that they see him in charge. If anyone fell overboard, there would be no chance of rescue him. Then on April 15, 1916, the 3 lifeboats made a landing on Elephant Island, an island of about 15 by 25 miles, which was uninhabited. As one crewman wrote in his journal, quote, "A more inhospitable place could scarcely be imagined," unquote. They had spent 7 fearful days and nights in open boats in the South Atlantic Ocean, at the beginning of an Antarctic winter, 170 days drifting on a floe of ice with inadequate shelter, and not since December 5, 1914, 497 days before, had they set foot on land. There was no hope of rescue. Shackleton knew that the outside world would never come to Elephant Island. There was only one remotely feasible course of action, and it was terrifying. Shackleton would take 5 men with him in the James Caird, a 22-foot wooden lifeboat, and make for the whaling station back in South Georgia, shown here in the yellow line, a distance of over 800 miles across some of the most dangerous water on the planet, south of Cape Horn in the winter. They would be navigating towards a small island with no points of land in between, using only a sextant and a chronometer, under brooding skies that might not permit a single navigational sighting. The task was not merely formidable, it was, as every crewman of the company knew, impossible. After adapting the lifeboat for its momentous journey and loading it with supplies, the Caird departed on April 24, 1916, for South Georgia, with 6 men on board, with their fellow crewmen waving and hoping and praying for their successful journey. The 22 men left behind under Frank Wild's command faced their own trials, surviving on penguins and seals, and living in a makeshift shelter under the 2 remaining lifeboats. Their trial by patience had just begun. Their helplessness was almost total, and they knew it. The Caird had sailed, taking with it the best of everything they had. Frank Hurley, who took this group portrait on May 10, 1916, described it as, quote, the most motley and unkempt assembly that ever was projected on a picture, unquote. Should the relief expedition fail, Shackleton instructed Frank Wild to take the men in the remaining 2 lifeboats in the spring and try to save themselves. The day after departure, the Caird's ordeal began in earnest. Of their 17 days sailing and rowing, there would be 10 days of gales, snow squalls, and heavy seas, including a full-fledged hurricane 2 days before landing. Icy waves drenched the men constantly. Beneath the canvas decking, 3 men at a time tried to sleep in wet and putrefying reindeer skin sleeping bags in a space of about 5 by 7 feet. One night they awoke to find the boat staggering in the water. Ice as much as 15 inches thick encased every inch of wood and sail. Despite the dangerous pitching and rolling of the boat, the men had to crawl onto the glassy decking and hack the ice away. There would be no hope of retrieving a man who might fall overboard in those stormy conditions. They were bailing constantly. The weather was so foul that in the whole journey, Frank Worsley was able to take a sight of the sun only 4 times with his sextant. He had to navigate mostly by dead reckoning, the sailors' calculation of courses and distance. Their proposed landfall, South Georgia, represented a mere speck in thousands of miles of ocean. If they missed South Georgia, they would be blown into oblivion towards Africa, 3,000 miles away. There would be no second chance. Then on May 8, 1916, their 15th day at sea, they saw land, South Georgia. They had done the impossible. It was a triumph of navigation as much as seamanship and endurance. On the evening of May 10, with Shackleton and his men at their very limit, the Caird ground onto a gravelly beach on the southwest side of the island, which they named Peggotty Camp, after the poor but honest family in Dickens' David Copperfield. They were standing at last on the island from which they had sailed 522 days before. Shackleton wrote in his journal, quote, "It was a splendid moment," unquote. Undoubtedly, they were conscious of having achieved a great journey. The voyage of the James Caird would be ranked as one of the greatest boat journeys ever accomplished in the annals of nautical history. Now they faced one more challenge. Shackleton had originally hoped to use this place as a stopover to replenish their water supply and to obtain a few days' rest, and then sail around the coast to the whaling station, which is on the northeast side of the island, about 125 miles away. But the battered Caird and his men were in no shape to do this. Instead, Shackleton decided that he and 2 others would cross overland to the station at Stromness Bay, a distance of only 25 miles as the crow flies, but over a route of jagged rocky mountains up to 5,000 feet high, covered with treacherous glaciers and crevices, overlain with deep snow and thick ice. To further complicate matters, no one had ever made this crossing before. No maps existed to guide the way. In short, it was impossible. Pictured here is a map composed after their island journey across the mountains, showing the route that they followed from left to right on the red line. On May 18, 1916, the 3 men started out for 3 days with minimal provisions, which included 2 compasses, a pair of binoculars, enough food for 6 meals, and about 50 feet of rope and an ice axe. During a lull between winter storms, they journeyed for 36 straight hours without sleep, afraid to stop for fear they would freeze and die if the weather turned worse. They sunk in snow up to their waists and inched along cliffs of ice, looking for passes through the uncharted mountains. At one point, they coiled their rope around them to make like a toboggan, and they slid down a 1,500-foot mountain slope in the dark, and later used the rope to lower themselves through a waterfall. Then at 7 a.m. on the second morning out, they heard the sound of a steam whistle, summoning the men to work at the whaling station. It was the first noise from the outside world they had heard since December 5, 1914, 17 unbelievable months before. When the 3 men descended from the mountains into the Stromness whaling station, 2 boys saw them and fled in terror. For 3 months they had been unwashed. For over 6 months they had no change of clothing. Their clothes were filthy, threadbare, and torn. Their stringy hair hung down to their shoulders, and their beards were matted with salt and blubber oil. They were taken to the manager of the whaling station, Thorolf Sorley, whom Shackleton had gotten to know well during Endurance's stop at South Georgia on its way south. Now, 17 months later, it was assumed that Shackleton and all his crew had perished. Sorley opened the door and stepped back with a look of disbelief on his face. For a long moment, he stood shocked and silent before he spoke. "Well," Sorley said. "Don't you know me?" said Shackleton. "I know your voice," Sorley replied doubtfully. "My name is Shackleton," he replied in a quiet voice. And again there was silence. And some said Sorley turned away and wept. Shackleton was asked, quote, What kept you going through the mountains? It was like this, he said. The thought of those fellows on Elephant Island kept us going all the time. It might have been different if we'd had only ourselves to think about. You can get so tired in the snow, particularly if you're hungry, that sleep seems the best thing life has to give. But if you're a leader, a fellow that others look to, you've got to keep going. And that was the thought that sailed us through the hurricane and tucked us up and down those mountains. And when we got to the whaling station, we didn't so much feel that we were safe as that we were saved, unquote. Within hours after arriving at the whaling station, a small ship was sent around South Georgia to Peggotty Camp to collect the other 3 members of the James Caird crew and the boat itself. Then on May 23, less than 72 hours after arriving at Stromness from across the mountains, Shackleton had organized a wooden whaler to set out for Elephant Island to rescue the 22 stranded crewmen. It was the first of 4 separate rescue attempts, lasting more than 3 months, during which the pack ice surrounding Elephant Island seemed determined that no rescue ship would get through to relieve the castaways. Finally, a small tugboat named the Yelko, with Shackleton on board, made it through to Elephant Island and made a successful rescue of all 22 men, who had been there for 4.5 months. All were safe. They had had a terrible time, waiting as patiently as they could in their miserable surroundings underneath 2 lifeboats and hoping against hope that Shackleton's boat journey in the Caird had not been lost. Through all of the long months of their terrible ordeal, Shackleton had lost not a man. One of his men on Elephant Island said to him, quote, "We knew you'd come back." Later, Shackleton said it was the highest compliment he had ever been paid. In summary, on each of his 3 earlier expeditions to explore the Antarctic, Shackleton had failed in his mission. And yet what he and his crew did succeed in doing in 1914 to 1916 was one of the most incredible feats of survival ever recorded. Every stage of their journey seemed more remarkable than the last. From January 1915, when Endurance was trapped in the ice, during its helpless drift through the Weddell Sea and its destruction in October, to the crew's long miserable months of camping on the ice, Shackleton held his men together under terrible conditions. Their 3-boat passage in April 1916 to Elephant Island was accomplished in spite of enormous odds. The voyage of the James Caird over 800 miles of winter ocean rivals any small boat journey in history. Their trek across the unmapped mountains of South Georgia was the first in that hostile mountain range. And the survival of the 22 crewmen in their hut on Elephant Island over one Antarctic winter is almost too much to believe. And yet it happened. Shackleton brought them all home on the Yelko to Punta Arenas, Chile, and then on to England. You might be interested to know that Shackleton made one more final trip in 1921 to make an attempt to circumnavigate Antarctica. Amazingly, 8 previous Endurance crew members signed on with him to go on another voyage with him. They arrived at South Georgia on January 5, 1922. The next morning, Shackleton had a massive heart attack and died at the age of 47. He was buried at the request of his wife on South Georgia, and that gravesite is pictured here. Some other follow-up comments about this story that might interest you. Blackborough, the stowaway, was the only one of all the 28 men who had somewhat of a major medical problem. He had to have 3 toes on his left foot amputated on Elephant Island in pretty gross conditions. The Bible that Shackleton dropped on the ice did not remain there. After Shackleton walked away, crewman Tom McLeod picked it up and put it in his coat vest and walked away with it, and it still is in existence at a museum in England. The cat belonged to the carpenter of the ship, Chippy McNish, and the cat was named Mrs. Chippy, but it was really not a Mrs., it was a tomcat. Most of the crew returned to England and got involved in World War I. Several were killed in action within a few months after returning. The last surviving crew member, Lionel Greenstreet, died in 1979 at the age of 89. The lifeboat that James carried, along with other artifacts and that Bible, is now in a Dulwich, England museum. And lastly, I'd like to just show this picture of Shackleton's thoughts on leadership. And there's a few in here that I like very well. There are lots of good things in the world, but I'm not sure that comradeship is not the best of them all. To know that you can do something big for another chap, unquote. Optimism is true moral courage. Leadership is a fine thing, but it has its penalties. And the greatest penalty is loneliness. A man must shape himself to a new mark directly. The old one goes to ground. The loyalty of your men is a sacred trust you carry. It is something which must never be betrayed, something you must live up to. I have often marveled at the thin line which separates success from failure. You often have to hide from them not only the truth, but your feelings about the truth. You may know that the facts are dead against you, but you mustn't say so. And lastly, one of my favorites. If you're a leader, a fellow that other fellows look to, you've got to keep going, unquote. And I thank you for your interest and time in this subject, and look forward to another opportunity to be with you on another great moment in history.